Welcome to Safety Chats. Host Jason Stark, Director of Safety at Baldwin Safety and Compliance, shares decades of aviation experience and a passion for safety, with an emphasis on healthy and robust safety cultures in aviation and transportation organizations. Since 2004, Baldwin has partnered with transportation providers to help pilots, safety managers, frontline teams, and others to integrate, document, and build positive safety cultures in organizations. Each podcast episode will focus on an element of safety that can help you in your workplace, whether it's a cockpit, vehicle, or hangar. Let's get started with this week's Safety Chat.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Baldwin Safety Chat podcast. Man, I am so happy you're here. You're probably thinking I say that all the time. It's because, well, I really am happy that you're listening. It's fantastic. And I love to interact with all of you and get any ideas, which I always cover at the end and ask for. But just really happy to be here. Really love the fact that spring's starting to come, especially down here in Houston. Well, I guess it comes a little earlier than other places in the world. But today I had a thought. I kind of was thinking about the FRAT, and not digging on the FRAT or the Flight Risk Assessment Tool, as it's known, or we could look at it generically as a pre-flight evaluation of potential threats. So I was looking at that and wanted to talk a little bit about that and add the notion of complexity. And so that might actually end up being a little fun. We'll see where it goes. But all of you are very familiar with the idea of a flight risk assessment tool. I think it was first mainstream back in 2007 under Information for Operators, the FAA Information Operators 07015. Actually is the wonderful result of a doctoral dissertation, and went through CAST and then ended up at the FAA. And there's a lot more to that story that definitely talk about another time. But the fact of the tool, it was kind of revolutionary at the time, and it still kind of is. But it's a fact of quantifying. I guess you'd say it quantifies ahead of time, or a priori, if you want to use another word. But it quantifies a potential threats to a flight. And importantly, two things important, I'll cover this a little bit, but it provides awareness to the crew of what's going to be faced. But importantly, it allows the organization, in the flavor of organizational accidents, it allows for the organization to intercede and adjust the items, or adjust the, I'm gonna say quote unquote risk, but adjust the risk prior to the flight in a very proactive way of addressing potential failures that could end up resulting in an accident. So it is actually revolutionary. And the original FRATs, the original items on the FRAT, which you can read in Info 07015, they were a result of a lot of research, a lot of study on accidents that were occurring in the industry at that time. And based on that, that's how they were given their weighting, and even the items themselves. Well, let's fast forward to today, and we see that I think it's easily argued that the FRAT is very prolific. I know when I was with IBAC, and if I'd go to Europe or Asia and teach and talk about the FRAT, when I was with IBAC, it wasn't really well known. But what I'm seeing today, that even today now, it is even well known in places like Europe and Asia and Africa and whatnot. So it is very prolific, and it's being used by several hundreds of organizations to give them a sense of what they'll be facing and whether or not the organization needs to intercede. But when it comes to working with clients about the FRAT, I see a lot of different exercises, if you will, in terms of what items are going to be on the FRAT and what the score of those items should be. So let me back up there for a second and put this into context. So there are some tools like the Baldwin tool that allows you to customize or choose what is on the FRAT, and also choose what those scores are, which is important. That is absolutely critical, because if you're using a FRAT that is hard-coded, hard designed, it may not even describe what your organization is or what your organization is even concerned about appropriately, as would a tool that allows for customization. And maybe that'll make more sense after the talk. So when I get asked a lot, well, Jason, what items should be on my FRAT, or what should be the score? We also see, it being done in 2-hour phone meetings, saying, well, maybe we should have this. Yeah, I think that's a good idea. And it has me scratching my head, because there needs to be a lot more, I think, thought to it. Or maybe not more thought, but different thinking to it. And this is where I jump in. First of all, we're going to talk about items on the FRAT, and we're going to talk about scoring briefly. But when it comes to coming up with items on the FRAT, I see a lot of items that are on this pre-flight risk assessment tool that address topics that we as pilots are already trained to address. So I look at things like, well, they say, okay, well, we're going to be flying into IFR, or there are restricted areas or TFRs along the route of flight, or there's turbulence en route. And we are made aware of that stuff, especially in pre-flight briefings, getting all that information. But we are trained for that. We are absolutely trained for that. So it's not a matter of saying, okay, well, yes, I mean, we understand IFR, specially approaches, done to minimums. There is a notion of risk there in terms of probability and severity. But there's that probability side that I'm kind of looking at, that we are trained for that. I mean, constantly in simulators or even in the aircraft, we are trained for that. So the organization then really strives to say, okay, well, they say, well, if we put in, maybe low IFR approaches, well, we should put IFR departures, we should put this and this and this and this, and the list goes on. And next thing you know, we have these pre-flight tools. The pre-flight environment is pretty busy, and we have these pre-flight tools that become very long and bloated with stuff that I think personally we are trained to do. The pilots are trained to do, or in the case of maintenance, mechanics are trained to do, or in the case of line service professionals are trained to do. And it takes me back to a couple books that I'm going to touch on here. Let me take a segue. There's 2 books that I'm going to kind of draw on today for today's discussion. One of them being the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, and the other one, Pre-Accident Investigation by Dr. Todd Conklin. 2 wonderful books. I really highly recommend reading them. As a matter of fact, I hate to advertise another podcast on this podcast, but Dr. Conklin, Todd Conklin, does have his own podcast, actually called the Pre-Accident Investigation Podcast, which he is extremely entertaining. Especially, you would think, PhD, they wouldn't be, and I'm not making any knocks against PhDs, but he's like super entertaining. So Todd Conklin, Atul Gawande, the Checklist Manifesto, and Pre-Accident Investigation Podcast. So going back now to this, what the items on the FRAT, we are trained a lot of those items on the FRAT. But when I look at when looking at some of the points being made in the Checklist Manifesto, when we as an organization try to enumerate every possible thing that we can face that we're even trained to do, we kind of do that in vain, because we try to control every single risk, or at least address every single risk above and beyond what it's already addressed through training, through hardware, whatever it might be, where a flight may fail. So it's important that it's important to note that with our training and with the controls that are already into place, and the FRAT itself isn't looking specifically to apply a mitigation, whether it be the hierarchy mitigations from engineer control down to personal protection. That's not the point of the FRAT. It's to mitigate a particular item as like a formal mitigation. It's when we talk about mitigating on the FRAT, we're either talking about removing it or waiting or avoiding, whatever it may be. But we have to understand that the things in our system, we have to allow the individuals, the crew, to face them. And it is well known that as the crew or the line service, the mechanic, we have the ability to adapt based on our solid foundation of training and checking. So when we try to look at every item that is normal, that is a normal threat, if you will, or a normal item in our flight, approach to minimums, even to some extent circling approach, mountainous terrain, TFRs, whatever it may be, we are trained to deal with those, and we are able to adapt. Right? We are able to adapt to these during a given flight. We learn about them in pre-flight, hopefully, and then during the course of the flight, we're able to adapt. Either we might have a plan in place, because during our pre-flight we would talk about that, or if it's something we didn't know, we would adapt. So, but here is the problem. Okay, here is the problem. When we look at the things that we may have to adapt to in a given flight, that in itself may become problematic. So let me explain. So try to picture a normal flight. What would a normal system flight be? Well, generally speaking, you have a crew that's rested, and maybe I should say ideal flight, but you have a crew that's rested and fit for duty. You have an aircraft that is airworthy and free of any squawks or MELs. You have a normal, and I guess I put this in quotes, normal weather pattern along the route. You have normal weather. You have normal airport infrastructure. You have normal ATC interaction. You have normal passenger interaction. You have normal procedures, air traffic procedures. So try to picture that, and then what is this thought then if more and more is added to that? And it's this idea that when we put more and more into the system or into the context that we're operating, it's more and more that we have to manage and get right. And according to Atal Gawande, defeat under conditions of a complexity occur far more often because of trying to manage and get more and more right. So that was the really interesting concept that I kind of apply now to what items do we need on the FRAT. So let's go back to this idea of a normal operating context. What happens when in this normal operating context, the complexity is increased greatly? So when you start adding things that the pilot or the crew needs to adapt to in a given operating context above and beyond what is normally expected based on their training and checking. So when the systems aren't quote-unquote normal and the complexities increase greatly, that greater complexity can present a context that exceeds our knowledge and adaptation capacity. Now think about that for a second. So it's kind of like that idea that, yes, as crew, we are able to take in various different events within our operating context, and we're able to adapt. But what happens if that number of events that we have to adapt to within the context exceeds our capacity to adapt? And I think it's really fascinating that Eric Hullnagel, who is really well known in the resiliency engineering field, he says a failure is the unexpected combination of normal performance variability. So on any given thing that we need to adapt to, that we need to do, if you will, there's going to be performance variability. We're going to do it either spot on or way spot off, maybe be the other way to say it. Which I truly believe in a normal system, in our normal operating context, there is that margin that allows us to maybe fail and recover, which is completely within our capacity. But when we start getting into a context that is super complex, that has a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts, it is there where I feel the system could actually become an environment where our adaptation and our normal performance variability will take us outside of the capacity to fail safely, if you will. And so when we look at those points on the FRAT, what we should add I think it's helpful to look and say, okay, what items that would be not part of the normal system that would greatly add to its complexity. And it's based on this where I feel in the planning phase that when these are identified, and I'll even argue quantified, it allows then a scale or an idea of when the organization should intercede and take action to adjust the context so that there is this notion that allows for normal performance variability within the capacity of the system. It still allows us to fail safely, if you will, if we do have poor performance, and it's not so rigid that one mistake, for example, may cause the whole thing to come tumbling down, is another word. So chew on that for a second. I'm going to take a break. Be right back.
With Baldwin Virtual Training, you can take a safety course on your schedule from anywhere in the world. From frontline training to advanced training for safety managers can help you succeed in your workplace. Visit baldwinvirtualtraining.com to learn more. Now, back to Safety Chats with Jason Stark.
All right, welcome back. So we had a head full there, didn't we? So we talked a little bit about, what items should be on the FRAT, and we talked about the idea that a lot of the items I see on the FRAT are normally, items that we are, in a sense, that we are taught, or we in our learning, in our training, we are taught to deal with. It is this idea, though, that it's those items that are in the system that can increase its complexity, or in the operating context that can increase its complexity. And it's when we have that increased complexity that would force us to adapt more, and due to our performance variability, we could end up blowing away, I guess you say, our margins between failing safely and not. So this brings us now to the points on the FRAT. So when I look at the FRAT, to me, again, this is to me, I see the FRAT as a twofold instrument, if you will. One of them is one of the benefits of the FRAT is that it does create awareness in the crew of the operating context. I mean, when you're sitting there before flight and you're looking at the items that may be on your pre-flight evaluation, and you're ticking off what you'll be facing, it gives you, the person filling out the FRAT, and then through briefings, the crew, a very good sense, if you will, situation awareness of the context, of the operating context. And when I talk about the operating context, maybe I should have done this a little earlier, but the operating context is basically everything that's going on. Now, I want to put it, when I look at Dr. Todd Conklin in his pre-accident investigation book, he defines the context as everything that led up to the actual failure or event. And that's kind of giving it a pessimistic spin. When I talk about context, I'm not assuming a failure. I'm just talking about everything that's going on that led up to, or could lead up to, a potential failure or event. So obviously the FRAT, by doing this, it gives the crew a very good picture of the context. It also, again, in my opinion, is a great tool that can formally allow the organization to intercede if the context presents more complexity than what individuals are able to safely adapt to. And I think that is done brilliantly through points. And I know some people are like, well, what do these points mean? And I kind of agree to that, because they're kind of weightings. I mean, they're not really, empirically derived risk scores. They are weightings, but those points, I think, are important because it kind of quantifies and gives benchmarks and gives thresholds, if you will. And there are FRATs out there today that don't use points. And these FRATs, they're a tool that only present potential threats or added complexity. But the problem is, if they don't give points, then to me, they become just one part of those two things that I said a FRAT's good for. It does create great awareness. Now the crew can say, okay, yeah, we have this awareness, and the system might even be fancy enough to say, okay, this is the policy the organization has to address this. But we go back to my original argument that we're not addressing the risk of a particular item in the FRAT. To me, it's this idea that we're looking at items that can increase the complexity of the system. We have controls. You should have controls for every single item on your FRAT. Your organization should have controls, or the regulatory agency should have controls, or through your aircraft there should be controls, but there should be nothing uncontrolled on that FRAT. It's this idea of what's going to add to the complexity, I think. So the thing also about FRATs that don't use points is now we're putting that decision potentially right smack on the back of the crew or the operator or the frontline individual. And it is well said, and Conklin says this too, that failure happens when workers feel the possibility of getting the intended outcome is well worth whatever risk is presented in the environment or in the context. So we are kind of bent to getting the mission done, and we sometimes don't get a sense of, okay, we're going to face this. Yeah, I can handle this, face this. And our straw that breaks our back may be way beyond what the organization has diligently sat down and figured out what is truly the straw that breaks the camel's back. So with this, with the notion of points, we can allow the organization there's a point where the organization could come in and say, okay, we need to do something about this. And this is kind of a new thought, because when we're talking about fixing things, a lot of times we fix, the frontline individual, the pilot, like, okay, you're going to do this instead. No, you got to do this. No, you're not going to go here. And that's sometimes how we address the FRAT, is we're trying to fix what the pilots or the maintainer or the line service individual is going to do. We try to fix that. But rarely do we actually focus on fixing the system around the worker, as Dr. Conklin puts it, or could we fix the context? As an organization, can we fix the context? Can we look at the context and say there is too much complexity in here that's going to allow for too much performance variability beyond the margins of being able to fail safely? As an organization, can we do about it? So that's where I think the points are really critical, is to provide that point where the organization can come in and say, okay, we're going to do something about this. So the points themselves, like I said, are weights. And so to me, it makes sense that these are not really points of risk per se, because like I said, where they really describe, it's really not empirical risk. The way I'm seeing it done today is kind of perceived. A lot of times they'll maybe take the worst thing and then relate everything to that. I've seen so many different methods, it's crazy. But it's a weighting that describes, to me, it is a weighting that should describe the impact to the complexity of the system. So we're probably all clamoring for an example, and I'm going to see if I can take this mess out of my head and put it as an example. But let's say that you're doing a mission, and we'll talk a flight mission or flight, and we're operating under an O procedure or an operational procedure for an MEL'd item. Now, this is something, yes, we are trained to do it, but it's something that is out of maybe what's considered, quote unquote, the normal system, and it's something that actually adds complexity to what is normal. So we would say that it increases the complexity of a mission by X, whatever that value is. And then let's say that you also have in your pre-flight planning, you notice you have a very complicated arrival or departure, which again has the tendency to increase complexity, right? Because we're going to have performance variability on that, especially if we've never flown that procedure before, arrival or departure. So it can increase the complexity by Y, and then maybe consider flying passengers that have a history of showing up unannounced. You're like sitting there, they're not due for another 3 hours, and hey, we're here. And next thing you know, you're scrambling, and that adds a lot. And that can also increase the complexity by yet another score. So it is that X, Y, and Z, as I said, those three things, those scores, that will have values that describe the impact to the complexity. Now, we might ask, well, what are those values? Well, that's a great question, because as I think we all probably have sorted out or figured out, that items can have a different impact to complexity depending on the context, of course. I mean, this is something, we could say that an O procedure in this context it actually adds to the complexity a lot less than it would in this other context. And that is tough, and that is true, because it is going to vary. However, maybe we can give a sense of, okay, what's kind of the average impact? When we look at flying under an O procedure, like, for example, radar, O procedure, if you fly without radar, the O procedure is you can't have thunderstorms on the route of flight, so there's kind of a built-in mitigation there, but there may be some unforecasted thunderstorm that now all of a sudden you have to deviate around, you're doing it by sight, and you get the whole picture. But so that O procedure for that particular item could have a greater impact to complexity in one context, as I just described, versus a completely clear and beautiful day. So it's one of those that you might have to say, okay, we're operating under a procedure that's not normal anyway, and kind of group it as that, and then try to give like maybe an average impact to complexity. Didn't say this was easy. It's fun, but it's not easy, and there's still a lot that can be fleshed out about it. So like I said, items can have different impact to complexity, and that really depends on the context. And like I said, maybe looking at an average impact could be helpful. But knowing this, and this is where it gets important, knowing this, that if there is a notion of complexity that may exceed our ability to adapt, now the crew through the crew or a system that you have can alert the organization and say, okay, well, this is something maybe we need to look at reducing some of this complexity. Rather than what we normally look at, we remove items for a FRAT, or we say, we'll get somebody else, and that may be the case, but it's this notion of, rather looking at it than just ticking off items to reduce a score, it's understanding it in the context of complexity, and what can we do to reduce the complexity of the system, to remove that notion of there may be too much adaptation required by the crew that may allow for performance variability that is outside of our ability to fail safely. So, wow, there's a lot more to say on this topic. I think we're just kind of scratching the surface, and I think the industry is kind of groaning, if you will, in this direction. The FRAT itself was a great idea. It still is a great idea. This notion of proactively understanding the context and understanding if the context may be too complex, or in what we see today, too risky. And I put that in air quotes. I'm doing air quotes here. But I think the industry is kind of shifting in how they're looking at this idea of a pre-flight risk assessment. And I think it's evolving, which is a good thing. In academia, they talk about standing on the shoulders of giants. And I think that's what the industry is doing. I think we're kind of looking. Okay, we had this first iteration, which was great, which gave us a sense of our context. But how do we look at this context, rather than just as risk-based? Maybe it's complexity, maybe it's something else. I don't know. And like I said, there's so much more to say on this topic. My goodness, we could start talking about teamwork and who should be included in your pre-flight briefings. All this was really good stuff in both of these books, which I highly recommend you check out. But yeah, gosh, let me know what you think on this. This is not a rant, but maybe just to scratch your head a little bit and say, let's look at our FRAT. And do we have items on there that really add to the complexity, or are they just items that are already mitigated and we know the crews will adapt to them anyway? That's part of the normal system. Maybe look at that. What's part of a normal system? What's part of an abnormal system? Abnormal is kind of maybe not the right word, but it's something hopefully to have you take a look. So anyway, I had fun. I thought you did too. I hope you did. I shouldn't say I think you did. That'd be really egotistical of me. I hope you had fun with it. I hope you enjoyed listening. And like I said, we would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for listening. I really do appreciate it. I hope to see you in the next podcast. Thank you all. Stay safe.
This podcast is brought to you by Baldwin Safety and Compliance, the leader in safety management for the transportation industry. Since 2004, Baldwin has been providing state-of-the-art solutions and 24/7 support to the aviation and transportation industries. Baldwin's clients include all sizes and types of transportation operators. Baldwin provides safety and related business services to commercial and non-commercial transportation operators, medical transporters, FBOs, MROs, airports, flight schools, UAS operators, firefighters, OEMs, ground transport operators, and others. Visit baldwinsms.com to discover how Baldwin can enhance your organization's safety program.